If you've been playing Friends vs. Friends for long, you're no stranger to questionable balance decisions. Frozen Gun being released with a maximum duration of 8 seconds, Silence being released at cost 1 and with a maximum duration of 10 seconds, the massive buff given to Tin Man in March. Yet the recent July 4th expensive update was one of the more outspokenly criticized updates in FVF history, in part due to its balance changes, and in part due to other things. But right here and right now, the focus is the balance stuff. Balance stuff of all flavors, including more balanced than before, but still notably flawed, well-meaning but misguided, and concerningly out of touch with the current state of the game. This update's given us a lot to think about and talk about, and given my history, it makes sense that I took that as a challenge. So without further delay, here's my top/bottom 10 expensive update balance changes. The joke is that's all of the balance changes from this update. The Tin Man nerf. This was probably the best balance change of the patch, in my eyes. And while I'm certainly glad to see Tin Man be a little less mindless to use, it's still a ridiculously strong card, especially for its cost. I also can't say I've noticed a decrease in its ubiquitous popularity since the update, so evidently other players think it's still plenty strong too. Besides making it harder to rush down retreating enemies, the minus 50% speed penalty has made Karatov and the Deep Fryer even more effective counters to Tin Man than they were before, which is cold comfort anytime you're forced to deal with Tin Man without one of those two specific cards. So yeah, on the whole, I think the state of Tin Man has changed less than it first seemed. It's still a relatively cheap and easy to use card for just how much reward you get out of it, and it still affects teammates for some reason, and it still does Painkiller's job better than actual painkillers most of the time, despite the latter being more expensive and harder to use well. Personally, I'd like to see Tin Man's damage immunity be replaced with a partial damage reduction, like maybe a minus 80% or minus 75% damage taken. That would allow at least some form of retaliation besides fire or the occasional laser fence, and it'd make Tin Man less effective as a surefire second chance button at low health, which again is arguably more Painkiller's niche. If they implemented that, maybe increased the cost to 3, and maybe dialed back the speed penalty to compensate for those new nerfs, I think that would more meaningfully challenge Tin Man's meta dominance without rendering it toothless. I mean, hopefully, maybe that would be an overcorrection, but I'm just tired of seeing top-tier cards receive very timid nerfs that don't significantly alter their dynamic. I want to see more ambitious changes that take a risk in the name of hopefully finding a newer, better state of balance, instead of like this tiny little titration, tiny little adjustment, hopefully eventually getting to the right place. I don't know. Speaking of nerfs that don't meaningfully alter a card's dynamic, the shrinking spell changes. We got a very modest duration nerf from 25 seconds to 20 seconds, and a sizable damage vulnerability increase from plus 40% to plus 60%. A step in a better direction, definitely, but I don't think these particular nerfs really address the card's biggest sore points. Like, what's the biggest frustration about playing against Shrink Spell? I'd say the fact that if you're stuck without explosives, without fire, without stalling, without one of the few bullet weapons that are accurate and powerful enough to whittle down a shrunken player from full health, there is very little you can do to challenge Shrink Spell in the hands of a player with good evasive movement. And while the increased damage vulnerability has been kind of helpful on that front, it only makes so much difference when the target is just too damn small to land more than a couple shots on. If you happen to draw one of the cards that counters Shrink Spell well, you stand a perfectly solid chance, and that was true before the recent nerf. Now, explosives wreck Shrink Spell even more than they did before, but otherwise, you're still probably screwed. So while I welcome the duration nerf, I really think the damage vulnerability increase should be substituted for a size increase. I think raising it from 40% to 50% would be a good start, and that could be further adjusted later if needed. I think increasing the actual size of the player and not just their damage vulnerability would be more effective in shortening the massive gap between trying to kill a shrunken player without one of its dedicated counters and killing a shrunken player with one of its dedicated counters. The quick reload buff. I don't necessarily think this was a bad change, but it just kind of had me scratching my head. Like, wasn't quick reload already considered pretty damn good? The only reason I could imagine for buffing quick reload at this time would be as a sort of indirect nerf to slow reload. But, if the problem indeed is with slow reload and, it being really effective to stack and all of that, buffing quick reload seems like a sad way to go about fixing that problem. The Sly Shooter buff, yeah. I'm glad they tried to make Sly Shooter and Dale's personality card a little better with this vertical angle change, but the way valid back crits are determined still feels totally obtuse from the player perspective. And Sly Shooter is still very expensive at cost 3 for such a tame and situational buff that doesn't even apply to teammates. Looking at you, Tin Man, why do you get to have it all? And of course, though we now know that it wasn't intentional at least, the bug this patch introduced causing explosions and other unusual damage sources to count as back crits was very disruptive, shall we say. Once again, a well-meaning change that just sadly missed its mark, ironically. Dr. Molebot buff, this wasn't really a buff except at the card's lowest level. All they did was increase the healing per second from 1 to 2 at the card's minimum level. Which, a step in a good direction, but god, that's still just kind of pathetic, isn't it? I'm not even really sure what the point of perks is supposed to be when I think a better and more direct solution to improving the new player experience would be making less cards just really feel bad at low levels. There are some cards that are barely affected by being at low levels. They're still perfectly usable. I think Health Up comes to mind for that. And most weapons are at least usable at their lower levels. But Dr. Molebot starting even now at 2 health per second, or Bomb Belt starting at 2 bombs, wasn't as much of a problem before when the game was smaller and there was less to grind for, but now there's a lot to grind for, and it's pretty hard to get everything maxed out, so... Right, now the bomb buff, and by extension bomb belt buff, because the radius buff to bomb also applies to bomb belt. Before I mention anything else, I want to make my main takeaway on the bomb radius buff very clear. I do not think the newly buffed bomb and bomb belt are grossly overpowered. Overtuned, definitely, but not catastrophically quote-unquote broken. The greater issue to me is something subtler that I think a lot of players and potentially even the devs are missing in the aftermath of the change. Bomb and Bomb Belt aren't just stronger now, they're easier, a lot easier. They require less effort and give the enemy less agency in the interaction. What exactly made Bomb and Bomb Belt feel really enjoyable and quote-unquote healthy to me prior to the expensive update? In short, I thought they demanded a good deal more mindfulness and precision than many other burst damage cards. Because Bomb's long fuse and awkward bouncing and rolling limits its effectiveness as a fire and forget throwable, shooting the bombs to detonate them early has long been an essential part of using the card effectively. If you wanted to get any decent use out of Bomb, you basically had to learn how to do this and to pull it off fairly consistently. And I think what made this strategy feel skillful and fair was that 1, shooting the bomb required good aim and or at least standing still to make the shot easier, and 2, you had to throw the bomb close enough and time your shot well enough to actually catch enemies in its blast. With a much larger and more forgiving explosion radius, precision matters a lot less now. You still need to be accurate in shooting the bomb itself, but you don't have to fuss nearly as much about where the bomb explodes relative to the enemy. The process was tricky enough before that it felt clutch to pull off, but now it just feels cheesy. It's become yet another flavor of easy damage in this game, like close-range sticky bombs or health down, or throwing landmine vaguely near an enemy's feet. So how would I like to see this bomb stuff be fixed, for lack of a better word? I simply want the radius buff to be reverted entirely, and sooner rather than later so folks don't get too comfortable with it. And I'm acutely aware that this is not an exciting thing to ask for. Probably one of the most untempting decisions anyone can ever make for their own creative project is hitting Control-Z on a recent change or addition. Because 1, you presumably felt it was a decent idea with sound reasoning if you went out of your way to try it in the first place, and 2, even if you later decide it was flawed, there might be a sense of sunk cost that makes you hesitant to entirely give up on it. But I think this is an eat your veggies kind of moment where it's not a gratifying decision and you'll inevitably hear groans from some players, but it's what's better for the health of the game, so it's just the decision that should be made. And if we're insistent on giving Bomb some sort of compensation for reverting its buff, which I personally don't think is necessary, keep it super subtle, like increasing its max damage from 70 to 75, or else, we risk replacing one overcorrection with another. Sticky Bomb. So this one. I think the problem is much more obvious with this one. Sticky Bomb, before this update, was already among the strongest explosive cards in the game, and even among the strongest cost 1 cards in general. Besides dealing up to a whopping 100 damage, it's frankly pretty easy to use, given its short fuse and ability to stick to players directly. Even easier if you use cards like Ninja Smoke to get close and make the throw as short as possible. It was a contentious topic just how unbalanced Sticky Bomb was, but no one whose balance opinions were worth anything was claiming it deserved a buff. And yet, that's exactly what it got. Buffed from 100 damage to 110 damage. This is absolutely baffling. At least with the regular bomb buff, I can believe it came from a well-meaning place, trying to give bomb any sort of upside over Sticky Bomb. But the Sticky Bomb buff, I just don't know what the devs were thinking. And I don't mean that in like a rhetorical mocking AVGN, what were they thinking way. I mean, I sincerely struggle to guess what train of thought could have motivated this decision. My only hunch, and I need to stress I'm not at all confident about this, is that they implemented the radius buff to bomb first, decided that it did indeed make bomb considerably stronger, and were concerned that bomb would now overshadow Sticky Bomb? Maybe? I desperately want to hear from someone at Brainwash why the Sticky buff was pushed, because there's evidently been some sort of disconnect or failure of communication between the developers and much of the veteran player base regarding this change. Akimbo Laika. As far as I'm aware, this change was just a correction to a very obtuse oversight that caused the Akimbo Laika to deal 1 less damage than the regular Laika. So Akimbo Laika's dealt 38 damage on a torso shot instead of 39. Folks had known about this for a while, but it wasn't entirely sure if this was intended or unintended, but evidently it was unintended, and it's fixed now. That's nice. Hardly a balance change, though. Just kind of a bug fix. Bomb Lover. I mean, I'm hesitant to say that Bomb Lover shouldn't have gotten buffed because that just kind of makes me look evil. Obviously, Bomb Lover has been in a really unfortunate place for a long time. It's just sort of eternally been in the shadow of Bomb Belt, and honestly, it still is. Again, I don't think Bomb's radius should be more than 4 meters. Increase it from 3 to 4. I don't know why it wasn't the full 4 meters to begin with. Bomb Lover bombs already deal way less damage than normal bombs, even less damage than Bomb Belt bombs. So, I don't know. As always, it's hard for me to give suggestions on Bomb Lover because this card was already done really well. It's Bomb Belt. Why do we have Bomb Lover? Now we're just kind of stuck with this card that is probably doomed to forever be either a strictly better or strictly worse counterpart to Bomb Belt. And for now, it is still very much in the camp of strictly worse. And finally, the Spike Remington buff. I don't play Spike enough to have much of an opinion about this. Besides, I bought the Mick plush instead. But based on what people who are invested in Spike have been saying, the damage calculation itself still seems questionable. And even if we assume it is working as intended, it doesn't change the fact that the effective damage bonus Spike receives is quite underwhelming on most guns. Even more so considering Stevie still functions like a better Spike combined with DJ Newton when you're forced to make do with your starting weapon. I guess it's also worth clarifying that this issue probably stems at least partly from how the game in general handles damage modifiers and decimal rounding, and isn't strictly a Spike Remington problem. Though, of course, it is a problem for Spike Remington. All right, that's all 10 of them. In review, the expensive update had some things wrong with it, arguably. So, what now? I think the expensive update confirmed a problem we were already kind of aware of. Brainwash Gang's intentions as FVF's developers are not very transparent to us players, and it's dubious what community feedback is, or isn't, informing their decisions, and why. FVF's balance patch notes are like a black box. We see the changes they're pushing out, but we seldom get to see the rationale or design philosophy behind those changes. The best we can do is speculate, and with such little to work off of, speculation is not very productive. But once we see Sticky Bomb of all things get a buff, we know there's been a major disconnect somewhere along the line. They're out of touch with the state of the game, or we're out of touch with them, or everyone is just out of touch one way or another. This notion of transparency is one major motivator behind the publicly visible community-maintained Card Balance Bible, of which I'm a contributor. Virtually all the proposed balance changes there are accompanied by extended elaborations on the perceived issues of the card and/or why we think our suggestions might address those issues. We know at least some folks at Brainwash have checked out the document, but we don't know much beyond that. If our writings have influenced the developers' goals and decisions, we can't easily discern that from the patch notes we've seen. If they've simply found the document to be unhelpful for their purposes, for whatever reasons, we don't know that, and we don't know what we could be doing to help remedy that. Like, for example, the formatting of the document is admittedly kind of sloppy. When a card has multiple proposed changes, it might be hard to tell at a glance if those proposals are meant to be considered together or if they are mutually exclusive alternatives to each other. Most proposals also don't have specific authors, contributors, or supporters specified, so it's impossible to tell who wrote what or whether any given proposal has the endorsement of one person or several people. These flaws have persisted, I think, because, at least on our end, they're inconveniences that we can tolerate. But if they present major issues for potential readers, especially Brainwash devs, let us know, let me know, because otherwise they'll likely remain a low priority for us. Now, on an optimistic note, I do have one piece of potentially very good news regarding player-developer communication. Recently, Brainwash Gang reached out to collect a sample of balance change suggestions from a small cabal of community members. Myself, lucky enough to be among them.
You know how we've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb.
Our suggestions weren't guaranteed to be accepted, but they would at least be put before the dev team for serious consideration. There were two main stipulations. One, we were limited to 4 suggested changes in total, and 2, the changes had to be simple numbers replacements, so no complex reworks nor new functionality. With this limited scope in mind, we ultimately decided to focus our efforts where we thought they'd be best applied. Thus, there were a lot of cards that we thought urgently needed rebalancing, but chose to set aside because we didn't think numbers tweaks alone could adequately address their problems. Our final submissions were the following, if you'll read here on the screen. If these 4 changes remind you of the July 17th patch notes, well, you've probably already figured out it's no coincidence. And in case you were wondering, here are some alternatives that we had considered but didn't make the final cut for our 4 Genie's wishes. As I hinted at, we already know the devs accepted all 4 of our final suggestions. Wow! But the mid and long-term outcomes are still uncertain. How will our changes be received by other players once they have time to settle? Will we ourselves be satisfied with our own changes? Or will we find that our ideas just missed the mark in retrospect? And most importantly, what bearing might this have on future developer-player collaboration? I don't know. This isn't the first time the developers have implemented specific player suggestions, and I doubt it'll be the last. This instance was perhaps just a bit more formally structured than usual, though I think that alone could be a good omen. Of course, it hardly matters what significance I assign to it. Brainwash Gang are the ones in charge, so what matters is what they make of this, if anything in particular. So, now, we'll have to wait a bit and see, I guess. That's that. End video.
Well then, as you say, we're both coming through fine. Good. Well, it's good that you're fine then, and I'm fine. I agree with you. It's great to be fine.